Imagine a civilization so vast, so enduring, so profoundly woven into the fabric of human history that everything we call ancient, the Greeks, the Romans, the great empires of Mesopotamia, arose while it was already old. We speak of Rome and marvel at 5 centuries of dominance. We speak of Greece and trace 200 years of golden achievement. But Egypt endured for 3,000 years. When Cleopatra looked upon the Great Pyramid at Giza, that monument was already 2,000 years old. No civilization in all of human history has ever lasted as long. Not China, not India, not Rome. Egypt alone stood at the center of the world for 30 centuries, a record that may never be broken. And at the heart of it all, flowing dark and deliberate through a golden desert, was a river, the Nile, the source of everything, the reason Egypt existed at all. The Nile did not merely sustain Egypt. The Nile created Egypt. Every year, the river flooded, spreading rich, dark soil across the fields on either bank. When the waters receded, they left behind a gift of extraordinary fertility in a continent of extraordinary harshness. Crops grew where nothing should have grown. The people of the Nile, protected by desert, by sea, and by mountain, were safe and fed and free to build something extraordinary. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land. Beyond it lay the Red Land, the merciless desert that kept the rest of the world at bay. This is the story of the greatest civilization the ancient world ever produced. A civilization that gave humanity writing, mathematics, medicine, and monumental architecture. That looked upon death without fear and built monuments to outlast eternity. That rose and fell and rose again for 3,000 years. This is the rise and fall of ancient Egypt. Chapter 1. The Gift of the Nile. Geography, more than any army or any king, determines the fate of civilizations. And Egypt's geography was among the most favorable in all of human history. The Nile Valley is an oasis, a narrow corridor of green threading through one of the driest landscapes on Earth, desert on every side. Within this natural fortress, the Nile was everything: the highway, the calendar, the source of agriculture, of trade, of wealth, and of power. By around 5000 BCE, farming communities appeared along the river's banks. Over centuries, villages grew into towns and towns into centers of power. The Nile Valley organized itself into 2 distinct regions: Upper Egypt, the long, narrow valley to the south, and Lower Egypt, the broad, marshy delta in the north. Upper Egypt wore the white crown, Lower Egypt wore the red. Separate lands with separate gods, separate customs, separate rulers. And then, around 3100 BCE, at the very threshold of recorded history, they became one. The man who united them is known by 2 names, Narmer and Menes. The Narmer pellet, a carved ceremonial tablet discovered at Hieroconpolis, shows a king in the white crown striking down enemies of the north, then wearing the red crown in triumph, one of the oldest narrative images in human history. The unification of Egypt was, in the minds of the Egyptians, a cosmic event. The pharaoh was not merely a king, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, the guarantor of Ma'at, the divine principle of truth, order, and cosmic balance. When the pharaoh was strong, the Nile flooded on time. When the pharaoh was weak, chaos crept in at the edges. This theology bound Egypt together with a force more powerful than any army.
From their new capital at Memphis, the early pharaohs organized a bureaucracy, developed the hieroglyphic writing system that would endure for 3,000 years, and built the institutions of the world's first true nation-state. Egypt was ready to reach for the sky, literally. Chapter 2. The Age of Pyramids. The Old Kingdom, roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, was Egypt's first great age of power and glory, the era that gave us the pyramids. Around 2550 BCE, a pharaoh named Djoser was served by a man of extraordinary genius, Imhotep, his chief architect and high priest, later worshipped as a god. The monument Imhotep designed was unlike anything that had come before. 6 mastabas of decreasing size stacked atop one another, rising 62 meters into the desert sky. The Step Pyramid, the first monumental stone structure in human history. But it was only the beginning. Around 2560 BCE, a pharaoh named Khufu ordered a monument so massive it would not be surpassed in height for 4,000 years. The Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure of 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. 13 acres of desert, 146 meters tall, cased in gleaming white limestone that blazed like a second sun in the Egyptian midday. Its 4 sides aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree. The pyramid was not merely a tomb, it was a machine for resurrection. The pharaoh, encased within it, would ascend to the stars and join the gods of the eternal sky. 2 of Khufu's successors built their own great pyramids nearby, and beside Khafre's pyramid, emerging from the living rock as if the desert itself had dreamed it into existence, a monument unlike any other watched over the Giza plain with patient, inscrutable eyes, the Great Sphinx. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom ruled over a society of remarkable sophistication. Trade networks extended south into Nubia for gold, east for copper, north for cedar from Lebanon. Art flourished with a precision essentially unchanged for 2,000 years, a visual language in which every posture and every color carried sacred meaning. But the Old Kingdom could not last. Land granted to temples and officials drained the tax base. Regional governors grew powerful and independent. Around 2200 BCE, a prolonged drought struck the eastern Mediterranean. The Nile floods failed. Famine swept the land. Ancient texts speak of the storehouses emptied, the great institutions silent. The pharaoh, whose divine mandate rested on the promise of order and abundance, could no longer deliver either. His legitimacy evaporated. Regional strongmen seized power, the central government collapsed. The Old Kingdom was over. The age of the pyramid builders had passed. Egypt fell into its first great darkness. Chapter 3: Chaos and Rebirth. The first intermediate period, roughly 2181 to 2055 BCE, was a time of fragmentation and suffering that must have seemed like the end of the world. The country fractured along its ancient seams. Rival pharaohs, some controlling only a handful of cities, claimed the double crown while fighting one another for the Nile Valley. The neat, hierarchical world of the Old Kingdom dissolved into something messy, violent, and uncertain. And yet, within the chaos, something unexpected was happening. The elaborate funeral rituals once reserved for pharaohs, the spells, the sacred texts, the promise of eternal life, began appearing in the tombs of officials and local rulers. What had been the exclusive property of the divine king became available, at a price, to any sufficiently wealthy Egyptian. But Egypt's memory of unified greatness pulled relentlessly toward reunification. All that was needed was the right man. He came from Thebes. Around 2055 BCE, a Theban prince named Mentuhotep II launched a military campaign that, over roughly 15 years, reunified all of Egypt under his rule. His mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, its colonnaded terraces carved into the Theban cliff face, anticipated the great temples of the New Kingdom by centuries. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs who followed reformed the administrative system, launched campaigns into Nubia to secure the gold mines, and fortified the frontier with massive mud brick strongholds. Literature flourished as never before. The Middle Kingdom produced masterpieces of ancient Egyptian writing, the story of Sinui, a narrative of exile and return with surprising psychological depth, and the dialogue of a man with his soul, a meditation on suffering and the meaning of death. written in a classical Egyptian that later generations would look back upon as a golden standard. But as had happened before, and as would happen again, the forces of fragmentation eventually reasserted themselves. By around 1650 BCE, the central authority had weakened enough that the unthinkable became possible. Foreigners had come to rule Egypt. Chapter 4: The Hyksos and the Forge of Empire. The Second Intermediate Period was perhaps the greatest shock in Egypt's long history. For a civilization that had built its entire identity around the idea of Egypt as the center of a properly ordered cosmos, the arrival of foreign rulers was not merely a political crisis, it was a theological catastrophe. The Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands, were a people of Canaanite origin who had been filtering into the eastern delta for generations. By around 1650 BCE, they controlled much of Lower Egypt, ruling from a capital at Avaris. They brought technologies that would transform Egypt forever: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, superior bronze weapons. They adopted Egyptian royal titulary and worshipped Egyptian gods. But to the proud royal family of Thebes, they were an abomination, an open wound in the body of Mot, an insult that demanded a response. The pharaoh Seqenen-Re-Ta died in battle. His mummy bears wounds from Hyksos weapons, his skull smashed by a battle axe. His son, Kamos I, continued the war before his own early death. And then came Ahmose I, who completed what his father and brother had begun. Around 1550 BCE, after a prolonged siege of Avaris, he drove the Hyksos out of Egypt entirely. Egypt was reunified under an Egyptian king. But Ahmose did not simply restore the old order. He took the technologies of his conquerors and made them his own: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and superior bronze weapon. He transformed Egypt from a kingdom into an empire. Never again would foreign powers be allowed to grow strong enough to threaten the Black Land. Ahmose I founded the 18th dynasty, the beginning of the New Kingdom. The humiliation of the Hyksos had forged the greatest empire in African history. Chapter 5: Egypt's Golden Age. The New Kingdom, from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, was Egypt's imperial golden age. Gold poured in from Nubia and from the tribute of cities. The world came to Egypt, and Egypt went out to meet the world. Among the extraordinary rulers of the early New Kingdom, one stands apart for a different kind of audacity. Around 1473 BCE, a woman claimed the throne of the most powerful nation on earth. Her name was Hatshepsut.
She ruled as a full pharaoh, wearing the double crown and the ceremonial false beard that marked divine kingship, reigning for approximately 22 years. She sent a great trading expedition to the land of Punt, recorded on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bakri, its colonnaded terraces rising against the golden Theban cliffs. The expedition returned with living myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and incense beyond measure. At Karnak, she erected two of the tallest obelisks in the ancient world, their tips sheathed in electrum, flashing at dawn like captured suns. After her death, her stepson Thutmose III attempted to erase her memory. Images defaced, her name chiseled from inscriptions, her statues buried. For 3,000 years, she was largely unknown, until 19th century Egyptologists deciphered her cartouches and returned her to history. Her stepson was also the man who built the greatest Egyptian empire in history. Thutmose III spent years watching and waiting. When he finally assumed sole power, he unleashed 2 decades of military campaigning unequaled in Egyptian history. 17 campaigns in 19 years, driving north through Canaan and to Syria, reaching the Euphrates River. At the Battle of Megiddo, the first battle in history described in sufficient detail to be analyzed, he achieved complete surprise, seizing a mountain pass his generals declared suicidal.
Under Thutmose III, Egypt extended from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates. Egypt was not merely a kingdom, it was a superpower. The height of the new kingdom's splendor came under Amenhotep III, who ruled from approximately 1388 to 1351 BCE. Egypt under Amenhotep the Magnificent was so wealthy and so secure that it seemed to have transcended the ordinary world. His mortuary temple at Thebes was the largest ever built, its entrance marked by two colossal seated statues, each 18 meters tall, that the Greeks would call the Colossi of Memnon, still standing in the Theban plain today. By the reign of Amenhotep III, Egyptian art reached a peak of naturalistic beauty. Painters filled tomb walls with images of banquets and gardens, musicians and dancers, birds in papyrus marshes, and fish in blue pools. Images of a life so beautiful, so full of color, that they seemed to declare Egypt had achieved, however briefly, something approaching paradise. It could not last. It never does. Chapter 6. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramesses. The reign of Amenhotep III's son would become the most controversial episode in all of Egyptian history. He began his reign as Amenhotep IV. He would end it as something entirely different. In the 5th year of his reign, he declared that Amun, the king of the gods, in whose name generations of pharaohs had built their empires, was to be abandoned. He proclaimed one true god, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. He changed his name to Akhenaten, effective spirit of the Aten. He ordered the names of the old gods chiseled from inscriptions across Egypt, dismantled the priesthoods, and founded a new capital in virgin desert, the city we know today as Amarna. Was he a visionary monotheist, 500 years before the Hebrew prophets? A calculating politician using religion as a weapon against the priesthood's power? A mystic? A fanatic? The evidence supports all these interpretations, and none conclusively.
Beside him stood Nefertiti, the beautiful one has come, who appears in Amarna art with a vividness and individual presence that no other royal figure of the era matches. The painted limestone bust found in the sculptor Thutmose's workshop, now in Berlin, is perhaps the most recognizable portrait of the ancient world. Those perfectly balanced features, that elegant neck, those extraordinary eyes. Akhenaten's revolution did not outlast him. When he died around 1336 BCE, the old order reasserted itself with remarkable speed. A boy king followed, whose name had been changed from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. He was 9 years old when he came to the throne, perhaps 19 when he died. In November 1922, an archaeologist named Howard Carter made the greatest archaeological discovery in history, Tutankhamun's tomb, the only royal Egyptian burial ever discovered largely intact, its chambers packed with over 5,000 objects of incomparable beauty: the gold death mask, the gilded wooden shrine, the haunting, perfect face of a golden boy king staring up from 3,000 years of darkness. In death, the forgotten pharaoh became the most famous Egyptian who ever lived. After the Amarna period, Egypt needed a pharaoh of undeniable force and longevity. It got one. Ramesses II ruled Egypt for 66 years, from approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE, the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history. He fathered perhaps 90 sons and 60 daughters. He outlived 12 of his own heirs. He built more monuments than any other pharaoh, a record that stands to this day. In the 5th year of his reign, he led his armies north for a confrontation with the Hittite Empire at Kadesh on the banks of the Orontes River. The Battle of Kadesh was, by any military standard, a near disaster. He had been deceived by Hittite spies. He advanced too quickly, the Hittite chariot corps struck his lead division in the flank and shattered it, surrounding the pharaoh himself in a churning melee. Ramesses would proclaim for the rest of his reign that he called upon Amun, the god answered, and he fought through alone. No decisive victory was achieved,
But he turned this tactical draw into a monument of epic self-glorification, carved on the walls of 5 major temples, composed in verse as the poem of Pentuer. 16 years later, he negotiated the Egyptian-Hittite Treaty of 1259 BCE, the oldest surviving international peace treaty in history. Of all the monuments Ramesses left behind, none speaks more powerfully than the twin temples carved from the living rock at Abu Simbel. The Great Temple is fronted by 4 seated colossi of Ramesses himself, each 20 meters tall, carved directly from the cliff face. Twice a year, the rising sun penetrates 100 meters into the inner sanctuary and illuminates the gods Amun, Ra, Herakti, and Ptah, and Ramesses himself seated among them as a god made flesh. Ramesses the Great, the warrior, the builder, the man who made himself eternal. He died at approximately 90 years of age. His mummy survives. In 1974, Egyptian scientists issued it an Egyptian passport, profession, king, deceased, and flew it to Paris for treatment. The French government received Ramesses II with full military honors. Even death could not diminish Ramesses the Great. Chapter 7. The Long Decline. After Ramesses II, Egypt never quite reached the same heights again.
The Sea Peoples swept through the eastern Mediterranean like a wave of destruction. The Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the city-states of Canaan, all collapsed with terrifying suddenness, their cities burned and abandoned. Egypt fought back. Under Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples were defeated in both a land battle and a naval engagement in the Delta, depicted on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, the oldest recorded naval battle in history. But the world it preserved was a diminished one. The great empire was gone. Egypt survived the catastrophe, but emerged smaller, poorer, and more fragile. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the high priest of Amun was effectively co-ruling Upper Egypt. When the last pharaoh of the new kingdom died around 1070 BCE, even the pretense of unified rule dissolved. The third intermediate period, roughly 1070 to 664 BCE, was prolonged fragmentation. Libyan pharaohs ruled the Delta. The high priests of Amun commanded Thebes. Egypt had become a collection of competing city-states. And then, from the south, came an extraordinary reversal. The kingdom of Kush, the Nubian state that had grown up along the Nile, worshipping Egyptian gods, building its own small pyramids, sent an army north. The Kushite king Piye swept through Upper Egypt, proclaiming himself a restorer of Ma'at. His successors, the 25th dynasty, ruled all of Egypt for half a century, built pyramids, and restored temples. The Nubians, whom Egypt had once conquered, had become the guardians of Egyptian civilization. But from the east, a new power was rising. The Assyrian Empire swept westward with devastating force. In 664 BCE, Ashurbanipal sacked Thebes, the sacred city that had been the heart of Egyptian power for 1,500 years. The city of 100 gates, violated for foreigners for the first time in its history. The Assyrians eventually withdrew, leaving Egypt to the Saite pharaohs of the 26th dynasty. A remarkable final flowering. They looked back to the Old Kingdom as a golden age, deliberately imitating its art styles and classical literature. The arts reached a final, luminous refinement. It was magnificent, and it was, unmistakably, the last bloom of an autumn culture. Chapter 8. The Last Pharaohs. The Saite Renaissance could not hold back history. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt and added it to the Achaemenid Persian Empire. For 2 centuries, the country chafed under Persian rule. The last native pharaoh, Nectanebo II, was driven from his throne in 343 BCE.
And then, in the autumn of 332 BCE, a 24-year-old Macedonian general arrived at the gates of Egypt. Alexander of Macedon had already destroyed the Persian Empire in barely 4 years. When he arrived in Egypt, the Persian garrison surrendered without a battle. The Egyptians received him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He traveled to the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis, and there the priests confirmed what Alexander already believed. He was the son of Amun. He was a god. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, then departed east, never to return. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32.
His general Ptolemy founded a dynasty that ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic pharaohs adopted Egyptian royal traditions, built temples in the classical Egyptian style, the Temple of Horus at Edfu, the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, and established Alexandria as the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, home to the Great Library and the Pharos Lighthouse. But the dynasty was slowly bleeding, its wealth drained by war and palace intrigue. One by one, the kingdoms of the Hellenistic world fell to Rome. Egypt remained independent on borrowed time. And then came the last of them. Cleopatra VII ascended to the throne in 51 BCE at 18 years of age, the first member of her dynasty in nearly 300 years to learn the Egyptian language. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the royal palace to request his support. Caesar was charmed, captivated, committed. He restored her to power. They became lovers. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, out of the chaos of Roman civil war emerged a second alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony, master of the Roman East. Their relationship was one of the most famous love affairs in history, extravagant, passionate, and ultimately fatal to both. Antony's rival, Octavian, painted him as a man bewitched by an Eastern queen. In 31 BCE, at the naval battle of Actium, Octavian's fleet met the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra's squadron withdrew. Antony followed. The cause was finished. They fled to Alexandria. In August of 30 BCE, with Octavian's army at the gates, Mark Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra survived him by days. Held captive, facing the certainty of being displayed in chains in Octavian's triumph, she chose death. The traditional account says she died from the bite of an asp, the uraeus, the sacred serpent of Egyptian kingship, depicted rearing from the brow of every pharaoh's crown since the earliest dynasties, the serpent of Egypt taking back its queen. Octavian, who became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, annexed Egypt as a Roman province. For another 4 centuries, the hieroglyphic script continued to be written by a dwindling community of priests in their last strongholds. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Philae on August 24, 394 CE. And then the writing stopped. The priests were gone. The temples fell silent. A civilization that had lasted 3,000 years, longer than any other in the history of the world, had finally passed from the earth. But had it? Every obelisk that stands in the squares of Paris, London, Rome, and New York was brought from Egypt as a token of the awe it has always inspired. The pyramids of Giza are the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. The 365-day calendar, the concept of a divine king, the architectural forms of the column and the obelisk, the practice of embalming the dead, the very idea that the human spirit survives the death of the body. These are Egypt's gifts to the world, so deeply absorbed into the common inheritance of civilization
that we rarely pause to trace them back. 3,000 years. 3,000 years of kings and gods, of floods and harvests, of gold and glory and grief. Civilizations rose and fell around it. Empires that thought themselves eternal came and went like the desert wind. And through all of it, along the dark and living ribbon of the Nile, Egypt endured.
When you stand at the foot of a pyramid and look up at that impossible slope of ancient stone rising into the blue Egyptian sky, you feel it. The weight of 3,000 years, the ambition of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Egypt is not dead. Egypt is only waiting, patient as the desert, enduring as the stone, eternal as the Nile itself. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, consider subscribing to Throne and Tide for more stories of the great civilizations, the fallen empires, and the turning points that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next one.